When I was 18, I worked at my college's residence building at the front desk. I think I almost got assaulted or murdered. You be the judge. During the summer, the building operated as a hotel. So 2.5 floors were hotel rooms, and half of the third floor were for student rooms. The whole building operated with a hotel swipe key system that was pretty outdated. All of the doors were powered by 4 AA batteries. If the batteries died, there was a decently lengthy process to replace them and reprogram the door. A dark-haired guy came to the front desk from inside the building while I was working an overnight shift at around 1 or 2 a.m. He said he left his keycard in his room. I made him a new one, and made my first error of the night. Hotel guests could have as many room keys remade as they wanted. Students, however, were supposed to be given a temporary keycard and charged $2, which was to be returned when they located theirs. I gave him a new key for his room and asked if he was a student or hotel guest. He replied student. At this point, I should have checked our system to charge his account, but I was so caught up doing administrative duties, I forgot. I used to trust people way too easily at this job, but I quickly learned not to. Later on in the night, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m., he came to the desk and said he couldn't get into his room. I asked if he forgot his key again, and he said no, the door wasn't working. I asked if the light was coming on when he swiped his key card, and he said no. I figured the batteries were dead. I told him I'd have to change the batteries, and I went up to his room with him. He asked me for my name, and I told him, but he didn't tell me his. I opened the room door manually with a master key. I told him I'd have to prop it open while I worked on the back panel to replace the batteries. He said no, it's okay, I'll close it, and closed it and deadbolted the door locked. That was really weird, but I tried not to think about it. I had changed batteries on plenty of other doors. By this point, some students were iffy about having their doors propped open for the room to be on display for anyone walking by. He also had a really thick accent, and I thought he might be an international student since we had lots of students from other countries where English was not their first language. I gave him the benefit of the doubt and thought maybe it was just a language barrier issue. At this point, I really felt like something was wrong, but I tried to ignore it so I didn't freak him out. While I was trying to focus on fixing the door as quickly as possible, he kept trying to entice me to go further into the room, saying his bed was broken and he needed me to take a look at it, or there was something underneath it that needed to be fixed. He held out a little gold house key and said, "I have a key, go get it," and then he threw it under the bed. He also said that there was a leak under the fridge. He just kept trying to convince me to get down on the ground, throwing random problems at me. Obviously, I told him no. I'd send maintenance up in the morning to take a look at it, if anything was broken. I had my back to him, and he asked me if I would take off my glasses. I said no, I need them to see. His tone changed, and in the most steady, chilling manner, he said, "Ella, it's okay, you can take them off." And from behind me, he reached around to take the glasses off. I swatted his hand away and tried to keep my composure. I said no thanks, I need to keep them on. Even though he was creeping me out, I didn't want to be rude to him. I didn't want to get in trouble if he complained about me, or risk upsetting him and having him yell at me. I got up to grab something from the door repair kit and undid the door deadbolt to open it up in the process. He jumped towards the door and closed it again and told me to keep it closed. I told him no, I had to open it to start reprogramming it in the front. While I held the door open with my foot and grabbed something from the door repair kit, he started playing with the little wispy hairs at the top of my forehead and kept trying to touch my shoulder. I swatted at him again and asked him not to touch me and focused on getting the hell out of there. He once again tried to get me to follow him into the bedroom, saying that the bed was broken, and I went as far as the doorframe to see if I could spot any actual problem with the bed. This is when I realized he had nothing in his room. No dishes in the kitchen, no shower curtain in the bathroom, no sheets on the bed. This was not his room. My brain once again went back to the international student theory, thinking he had just arrived today and hadn't gotten the chance to buy anything yet. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew something was wrong. I fiddled around with the door for a few more seconds before announcing that it was fixed, and quickly gathered the door kits and left. Before I had reached the elevator, he came back out without his shoes on to follow me. He tried to get back in to get his shoes and called out, "Ella, the door isn't fixed. You need to come back." I went back and opened the door manually, and I told him if the door was broken, I'd have to send up maintenance to fix it in the morning. I knew he was going to try and follow me to the elevator again, so I closed the door behind me, and once he went inside, I ran down the stairwell as fast as I could. When I got to the front desk, I checked the computer and saw that the room he was in was supposed to be empty. It wasn't a student or hotel room. I locked myself in our back office and called campus security. He came down a few minutes later and went behind the desk. I yelled at him to get on the other side and wait. Now, I knew he wasn't a resident. He tore the corner off a slip of paper I had sitting on the desk and drew a flower on it, then put it back on the top of my papers. When security arrived, he ran back up the empty room and tried convincing them that he lived there so he wouldn't have to leave. He kept showing them his key, which had decided to work on the other door again somehow. They escorted him back downstairs and came to ask me if he really did live there. Obviously he didn't, and that's why I called them crying and terrified. He kept interjecting to argue that he did live there, but he couldn't even recall his room number when he was asked. Security asked him for a student card, and he couldn't produce it, so they told him he would have to leave if he couldn't prove he lived there. While they were grabbing his information, I listened from the office and could immediately tell he was lying. The number he gave was just a bunch of random numbers. The name he gave was prefixed by, as if he was trying to think of a name. When they asked him for his address, he just said, across the street. One security guard asked if he lived in the apartments across the street, and he said yes, but conveniently couldn't tell them what building number it was. He said his apartment was number 1200, but I moved into that building a few months later, and apartment 1200 doesn't exist. When security asked what his purpose was to be sneaking into a room, he just kept saying the ums and uhs and saying he didn't know. They'd ask, "Were you trying to see a friend? Do you know anyone who lives here? Were you here to hurt somebody?" And he kept fidgeting and saying, "I don't know. No reason. I was just here." He tried to tell them he was my friend, at which point I poked my head out of the office and said I've literally never seen him before that night. He left, and we didn't call the police because he didn't actually do anything, but it was still unsettling. My girlfriend at the time and I went camping 5 hours away from home for her birthday and our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there early in the afternoon. The guy at the entrance of the campgrounds mentioned that there was no one else staying there that weekend. All we could think about is how sick that was going to be. First, we drove down the long, narrow paths to our designated area. As you got closer to it, the road narrowed, so basically you had to walk back out to get out. We unloaded the car and got the tent set up and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent, but it was still bright out, so we just took in all of the nature we could and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, all built the exact same way. Like, I guess they were all a part of the campgrounds, but they seemed way too out of the way, and there was no sign of life. It felt eerie to be at, like we shouldn't be there. So we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in the tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before, and had no idea how to start a fire. We had bought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid. but everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves were far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going and ate hot dogs and marshmallows and spent some time looking at the stars. Then, we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and was wondering if we could just go back into the tent. So we put the fire out and crawled into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and told me to shush and asked if I could hear that. Before I could respond, we heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people were walking. I whispered to her that it was probably just animals or something. Then we heard mumbling, a low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound an animal could make. It sounded like words hushed and not elaborated. We sat in silence, staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing. Then, silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed. Eventually, my girlfriend said that we have to get to my car. The adrenaline was pumping, so I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me. Then, we ran to the car. I locked the doors. She kept saying that we can't stay here and no one should be here but us. I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were seemingly alone. I looked at her and told her that I'm gonna go grab our stuff and for her to stay in the car. We only had our cooler and our tent out. I hopped out and ran, grabbed our cooler, and tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, and slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus, and then shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything in the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes. I floored it in reverse, out of the camping area. Then, when we came to the fork in the road, it went 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down to get here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I was cursing under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle we had exited from, I could see the main path back to the gate, thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single small green light out in the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at 4 a.m. We never talked about the trip ever again, and I haven't had any desire to camp since. So a little background here. My father was in the Army for 21 years, retired, and moved to a very small town in Central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though we didn't need the money, between his retirement and what my mom was making as a bookkeeper and tax prep, he wanted to go back to work. He started working at various gas stations, and it being a small town, the owners wouldn't care if I came there and helped out with stocking the coolers or even running the register, as long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. The actual story I'm going to tell took place in 1990, and I remember the date well, because it was shortly after my birthday, and being 15 in Florida, I just got my learner's permit. My dad would let me drive him to and from work, just to get some experience on the road, both at day and at night. I was sitting in my usual spot at a table that was set up along the windows, book in hand, feet propped up, and a Mountain Dew on the table, along with some snacks. I would generally spend most of the evening that way, reading books, getting up to run the register and stock the cooler at different times. I remember glancing up because something caught my attention that was unusual, and I realized that a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on the I-75. This in itself was really strange, because where we were located, you didn't get many people walking. And definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured she must have broken down somewhere and was coming up to use the phone to call a tow truck or something. She came into the store, looked around for a few minutes, and I remember just getting a strange and creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story about how she had gotten stranded and needed a ride up to the next big town just north of us. Ocala was the town. My dad lets her know that he's working, and there is no way that he can take her. She turns around and looks at me, and while she is looking away from him, my dad catches my eye and subtly shakes his head no. I was confused for a second, but then she turns back to my dad and points at me, asking if I can take her. My dad responded back that I only had a learner's permit, and I wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere and then drive back. Normally, I would have done it, even though it was illegal, because I've done it a few times before already. I didn't argue with my dad, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally chatty with the customers, but for whatever reason, he was almost cold and dismissive of her. Turns out, he also had a bad vibe about her from the minute he saw her walking up the drive. Well, she cusses him out for a minute, and he basically tells her to get out of the store. She slammed the door closed. I thought the glass was going to break from how hard she slammed it. I kept an eye on her and continue to watch as she makes her way back up to the interstate and then starts up the northbound on route. Almost a year passes and I'm in my bedroom, less than a week before my 16th birthday. I hear my dad yelling from the living room, telling me to get down here and take a look at this. I quickly run to the living room and see my dad pointing at the TV, and I see the mugshot of the lady up on the screen. Immediately, I remember the lady who had been in the store. Turns out, I almost gave a car ride to Aileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and then later put to death.